Sometimes love doesn't knock, it just walks into your life completely unexpected. And for Alexander Hart, it all started with a simple job interview. The rain came down in sheets, heavy and unrelenting, as Emma Miller stood in front of the towering glass building of Hart Enterprises. She could barely see the top of the building through the downpour, and the cold wind made the rain sting her cheeks. Emma pulled her jacket tighter around herself, the faded fabric doing little to protect her from the chill. Her heart pounded in her chest, a rhythm that matched the hurried pace of her steps. The sound of her shoes slapping against the wet pavement echoed in her ears, reminding her how out of place she felt. She wasn't supposed to be here, not in this shiny, polished world of CEOs and billionaires. Emma was just a woman trying to make ends meet, a woman who'd seen more hardship than she cared to admit. The last few years of her life had been a battle, fighting to keep food on the table, to make sure her father's medical bills were paid, and to somehow keep her spirits up despite the weight of everything pressing down on her. Her father's illness had drained their savings, and the job she'd taken up to support her family had been barely enough to survive. Yet through all the struggles, she had held on to the belief that something better was out there for her, if she could only find it. When she had seen the ad for a nanny position at Hart Enterprises, she hadn't even hesitated. It wasn't just any nanny position. It was an opportunity to work for one of the most powerful and wealthy men in the city, Alexander Hart. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a widower, a father trying to raise his young daughter after the tragic death of his wife. And Emma couldn't help but wonder if this was the break she'd been waiting for. Maybe, just maybe, this job could change her life. But standing in front of the sleek glass doors, she couldn't help but feel a little out of place. The other people rushing by were all impeccably dressed, walking with purpose, as though they belonged in this world. Emma, on the other hand, wore a thrifted blazer that had seen better days and shoes that had long since lost their shine. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked in, and her self-consciousness grew with every step. Inside, the building was pristine. High ceilings, marble floors, and modern art that screamed of wealth and sophistication. Emma felt small as she followed the receptionist's pointed finger toward the elevator. The woman behind the desk didn't even spare her a second glance. Emma's heart raced as the elevator doors closed, the sound of the descending lift the only thing keeping her company. Her stomach was a pit of nerves as she made her way up to the top floor, where she was supposed to meet Alexander Hart. She had read a lot about him. Alexander Hart was a man who built his empire from the ground up, cold, calculating, uncompromising. And yet all those traits didn't matter when it came to Sophie, his 6-year-old daughter. Sophie had been the light of his life, the one thing that softened his hardened exterior. But after his wife's sudden death, Sophie had been struggling, and Alexander hadn't been able to find anyone who could care for her the way she needed. Emma hadn't expected much. She knew she wasn't what Alexander Hart was looking for. Her resume wasn't impressive, and she had no experience working in such a high-profile household. She wasn't even sure she belonged here. But she had nothing left to lose. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Emma stepped into the lobby. The entire floor was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows giving a stunning view of the city below. She walked toward the large office at the far end, where she was greeted by a tall man in a black suit. He looked like he belonged in a magazine cover. His chiseled features, sharp jawline, and intense blue eyes gave off an aura of authority that made Emma feel like a child in comparison. "Ms. Miller?" he asked, his voice deep and commanding. Emma nodded, unsure of what to say. "Please come in. Mr. Hart is expecting you." Emma followed the man into a large office where the CEO of Hart Enterprises sat behind a massive desk, working on a tablet. His dark hair was neatly styled, his crisp white shirt rolled up at the sleeves, and his posture rigid and composed. He barely looked up as she entered. "Mr. Hart," Emma began, trying to steady her voice. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me today." Alexander Hart finally looked up from his tablet, and Emma couldn't help but notice how piercing his blue eyes were. They seemed to see right through her, as if he were weighing her every word, every move. For a brief moment, Emma wondered if she was in over her head, if this was all a mistake. "You're here for the nanny position, correct?" His voice was smooth but firm. There was no warmth in his tone, just a matter-of-fact delivery, as though this were another business transaction to him. Yes, Mr. Hart. I'm here for the nanny position, Emma said, trying to remain calm despite the nervous flutter in her chest. Alexander set the tablet down and folded his hands on the desk, studying her intently. You seem different from the other candidates. Why should I hire you? He asked, his eyes not leaving hers. Emma took a deep breath. I may not have the perfect resume, but I've spent my life taking care of people. I know what it's like to give everything you have for the people you love. I may not be the right candidate on paper, but I know how to care for children, how to listen, how to make them feel safe. Alexander's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that made Emma wonder if he was seeing more than he let on. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze lingering on her for a long moment. You'll start tomorrow, he said suddenly, surprising Emma with the suddenness of the decision. Tomorrow, she asked, her heart racing. Just like that? Just like that, Alexander replied. You'll start with Sophie tomorrow. We'll see how it goes. Emma blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. I don't know what to say. Thank you. You're welcome, Alexander said, dismissing her with a slight nod. As she walked out of his office, the weight of the moment settled on her. She had just been hired. This was it. But she had no idea that this job would lead her into a life she never could have dreamed of, a life where she would not only care for Sophie, but where her heart would also find something she never expected: love. She wasn't just taking care of his daughter. She was slowly becoming the glue that held his world together, and in the process, she was unknowingly becoming the missing piece of his heart. The next day, Emma arrived at the Hart mansion early, her nerves like a tight knot in her stomach. She had never seen a place so grand, an estate that could have belonged to royalty. The long driveway was flanked by perfectly manicured hedges, and the house itself looked more like a castle than a home. Despite its opulence, there was something cold about the place. She couldn't put her finger on it, but it felt like a house that hadn't seen warmth in a long time. When the large front door opened, a tall butler greeted her with a courteous smile. Ms. Miller, welcome. Mr. Hart is expecting you. He led her inside, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors as they walked through the vast foyer. Emma couldn't help but be in awe of the grandeur around her, yet it all felt strangely empty. The polished surfaces and elegant furniture screamed wealth, but there was no laughter, no warmth in the air. They arrived at a small sitting room where Sophie was waiting. Emma's heart immediately softened when she saw the little girl. Sophie looked just like her mother, dark curls framing her face and large, expressive eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the world despite her young age. Sophie was sitting on the couch, a toy in her hands, her gaze distant and withdrawn. Good morning, Sophie, Emma said gently, kneeling in front of her. Sophie didn't respond immediately, her eyes scanning Emma as though trying to figure her out. Emma smiled, trying her best to be warm and approachable. I'm Emma. I'll be helping take care of you from now on. Sophie's lips parted slightly, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she just stared at Emma for a long moment, her gaze piercing and calculating. Emma could feel the weight of Sophie's silence and the wall she had built up around herself. It was clear that Sophie had been through something traumatic, something that made her wary of strangers, of everyone, perhaps. But Emma had faced her own battles, and she knew the importance of patience. Would you like to show me your toys, Sophie? Emma asked softly, holding out her hand. Sophie glanced at her hand, then slowly took it, standing up. There was a hesitant quietness to her movements, as though she wasn't used to trusting anyone anymore. Emma didn't rush her. She simply led her toward the nearby play area, where Sophie showed her a few of her favorite stuffed animals. As the morning passed, Emma realized that Sophie wasn't the only one with walls built around her. The house, too, seemed to echo with a sadness that was impossible to ignore. But she also noticed something else: the way the staff interacted with her. They were polite, of course, but there was a certain stiffness in their gestures, like they were walking on eggshells. It wasn't just Sophie who had been affected by the tragedy. The entire household felt the weight of it. Around midday, Alexander Hart appeared. Emma had only seen him from a distance the previous day, but today he was right in front of her. He was tall, commanding in presence, his dark hair slightly tousled, as though he hadn't bothered with the usual meticulous grooming. There was an intensity to his expression that made Emma's heart race, but it wasn't just from his striking appearance. It was the way he seemed to carry the world on his shoulders, the same way Sophie did. She could see the tiredness in his eyes, the subtle signs of someone who had been running on empty for far too long. "Sophie, how are you today?" Alexander asked, crouching beside his daughter. His voice was low, gentle, but there was a distance in it, a quiet desperation to reach her that she wasn't ready to give. Sophie didn't answer. She simply stared at her father, then at Emma, her expression still unreadable. "I see you two are getting along," Alexander said, glancing up at Emma with a hint of approval. Emma nodded, though she couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence hanging between them. There was something unspoken between father and daughter, something that was beyond her understanding. It was clear that Sophie had been through a lot, and so had Alexander. They were both lost in their own ways, navigating a world that had changed too suddenly. As the afternoon wore on, Emma spent more time with Sophie, playing with her, trying to build some trust. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so needed, so important. Sophie may not have said much, but there was a connection starting to form. The quiet smiles, the small gestures, the way Sophie began to trust her enough to share her toys. It was all so subtle, but Emma could feel the changes. Meanwhile, Alexander had stayed in his study, working on business matters. He would occasionally glance at the two of them from the doorway, watching his daughter interact with Emma. He didn't know what to make of it yet, but there was something about Emma that was different from the other nannies. She didn't try to force Sophie to talk, didn't pressure her to open up. She simply let Sophie be, and somehow that was enough. That evening, as Emma was about to leave, Alexander approached her in the hallway. There was a tension in the air, a moment where the world outside the mansion seemed to disappear. "Emma," he said, his voice low, "I wanted to thank you for today. Sophie, she doesn't open up to just anyone." He paused, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "I know it's not easy for you to step into our lives like this, but I'm grateful. Sophie needs someone like you." Emma smiled, though her heart raced at the unexpected sincerity in his words. She didn't know where this was heading, didn't know what this job would mean for her in the long run. But as she looked into Alexander's eyes, she felt something stirring inside her, something she hadn't expected, a connection that went beyond the walls of this mansion. "Thank you, Mr. Hart," Emma replied softly. "I'm just here to help. I want to make things better for Sophie." There was a long pause, and then Alexander nodded, his jaw tight. "I'll see you tomorrow, Emma." "See you tomorrow, Mr. Hart," she said, and with that, she left the mansion, her mind swirling with thoughts she couldn't quite comprehend. Something about this place, about Alexander, made her heart ache in a way she didn't understand. And as the night settled over the city, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't even begin to predict. He didn't know when it happened, when the thin line between duty and desire had blurred. But now, with every glance, every quiet interaction, he was starting to realize just how deeply she had begun to change him. The days that followed seemed to blur together for Emma. Each morning, she arrived at the Hart Mansion with a growing sense of purpose, and each evening, she left with the unsettling feeling that she hadn't done enough. Despite the strides she had made with Sophie, those little moments of connection, there was still an invisible barrier between them. Sophie was still quiet, still guarded, as though she were waiting for the other shoe to drop. But as the days passed, Emma couldn't help but feel a deep sense of attachment to the little girl. Sophie was smart and perceptive, her eyes always watching, calculating. And even though she rarely spoke, she had a way of communicating with Emma without words, through the gentle touches of her small hand, the way she would curl up beside her during story time, or the way her smile would slowly creep onto her face when Emma would make a funny face or tell her a silly story. As for Alexander, Emma had learned more about him than she ever expected. The CEO was as distant and closed off as he had appeared during their initial meeting, but there were moments when he let his guard down, brief glimpses of vulnerability that were hard to ignore. He'd occasionally show up to watch them, standing in the doorway of the playroom, his arms crossed as he observed them. And when he did, Emma felt the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the stern, detached look she was used to seeing from him. It was something more. It was something that, for a split second, made her wonder if he was seeing her in a different light. One evening, after another long day of working with Sophie, Emma found herself alone in the kitchen, preparing dinner for the three of them. It was a simple meal, nothing extravagant, but the sense of routine, of normalcy, was oddly comforting. Sophie had finally gone to bed after a particularly challenging day, and Emma had just finished setting the table when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. "I hope you don't mind, but I thought I'd join you for dinner," came Alexander's voice from the doorway. Emma turned, surprised to see him standing there, looking as put together as ever, though there was a slight weariness in his expression that caught her off guard. "Oh, of course, Mr. Hart," Emma said quickly, trying to mask the sudden rush of nerves she felt. She had become accustomed to his presence in the house, but something about seeing him now, so close and so unexpectedly, made her heart race. "I've prepared something simple. I hope it's okay." "It smells wonderful," he replied, stepping further into the kitchen. "Sophie's already in bed?" Emma nodded, stirring the pot on the stove. "She fell asleep after her bedtime story. She's been a little tired lately. I think she's still adjusting." "Adjusting?" Alexander repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "To you." Emma paused, her hand stilling over the spoon. "I think so. She's a little slow to trust people, but we're getting there." She turned to face him, meeting his eyes. "She's been through a lot, Mr. Hart. She's only 6, but she's seen and felt more than any child should." There was a long silence between them, and in that silence, Emma could almost feel the weight of his own experiences pressing down on him. She had learned enough about Alexander in the short time she had worked with him to know that he wasn't someone who opened up easily. His grief over losing his wife was something he rarely spoke of, but Emma had seen the subtle signs. His stiff shoulders when he mentioned her, the way his eyes darkened when the topic of Sophie's mother came up. "I know," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "I know more than anyone just how much she's been through." His gaze met hers again, but this time there was something different in it. Something raw. Something honest. "It's just hard. Watching her pull away from everything. Watching her try to make sense of the world when everything she knew was ripped away from her." Emma's heart tightened in her chest as she listened to him. She wanted to say something to comfort him, but she didn't know how. She wasn't sure she was the right person to offer him the kind of comfort he needed. After all, she was just the nanny, the one hired to take care of Sophie, not the one hired to help heal the broken pieces of his heart. "I understand," Emma said quietly. "It's hard for her, but it's hard for you too, isn't it?" She looked down at her hands for a moment, feeling the weight of the words she had just spoken. "You've been through so much, Mr. Hart. I can see it in your eyes." Alexander didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer to the counter where she was standing, his presence filling the space in a way that made her heart beat faster. There was a tension in the air, an unspoken energy that seemed to hum between them. Emma tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the dinner, but it was impossible to ignore the pull between them. The way his gaze lingered on her, how he seemed to stand just a little bit too close. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You probably don't want to hear about my problems. You have enough to worry about with Sophie." Emma shook her head, feeling a strange ache in her chest. "It's not that. I just... I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this." She paused, meeting his eyes. "You're not alone, Mr. Hart. Not with Sophie. And not with me." The words were out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted them. She had no right to say something like that. She was just the nanny, just the woman taking care of his daughter. There was no place for her in his world, especially not in the way she had just implied. She could feel the heat rise to her cheeks, and she quickly turned back to the stove, hoping he hadn't noticed her slip. But Alexander's voice was steady when he spoke again. "Thank you, Emma, for everything. You've done more for Sophie than anyone else ever has. I don't think you realize how much that means." Emma swallowed hard, unable to look at him. She didn't know how to respond. His words had left her feeling exposed, vulnerable in a way she wasn't prepared for. She had come to this job to help Sophie, to make sure she was okay. She hadn't expected to find herself caring about Alexander, too. But now every glance, every quiet word they exchanged seemed to change the dynamics of their relationship. She wasn't just a nanny anymore. She was becoming something more, someone who mattered to both of them in ways she hadn't anticipated. And yet, the more she felt herself drawn to him, the more she realized that the distance between them, the barriers he had built around his heart, would be the hardest to overcome. In a house filled with so much emptiness, she was the one thing that made him feel whole again. But he couldn't allow himself to feel that way. Not with her. Not with someone who was only supposed to be a temporary part of their lives. The following week felt like a series of small, stolen moments. The mansion, despite its cold grandeur, had started to feel more like a home, all thanks to Emma's gentle presence. Sophie, still reserved and distant, was beginning to open up. She would no longer hide from Emma, nor would she avoid their quiet playtime in the corner of the living room. The walls Sophie had built were slowly crumbling, though the scars of her past remained. But as the days turned into weeks, Alexander found himself watching them more than he had ever intended. He didn't know when it started, this feeling of longing he couldn't explain. It wasn't just gratitude for Emma's care for Sophie. It wasn't even the tenderness in the way she'd handled his daughter's broken heart. It was something else, a connection that was both undeniable and terrifying. One evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Alexander found himself lingering in the study long after he should have retired for the night. He glanced at the clock, well past midnight. But he couldn't bring himself to leave, his thoughts scattered, his mind occupied by images of Emma's smile, the way her laughter made the house feel a little less empty. He had never allowed himself to get close to anyone since Charlotte, his late wife. The memory of her had been a constant ache in his chest, a wound that never seemed to heal. But Emma, she was different. She was kind and genuine, and somehow she made him feel things he hadn't felt in years. A sudden knock on the door broke his thoughts. He turned, startled. "Come in," he called, his voice rough from exhaustion. It was Emma, standing in the doorway with her usual quiet grace. She wasn't in the midst of her typical caregiving routine. Instead, she was simply there, looking almost tentative as she entered. Her presence seemed to fill the space, her gentle energy pushing back against the coldness that always clung to the corners of his home. "Mr. Hart, I'm sorry to interrupt," she said softly, her eyes hesitant. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay. You've been working late the past few nights." Alexander blinked, surprised by her concern. He hadn't realized how much time had passed. He had been so consumed by his thoughts, by the weight of his responsibilities, that he hadn't noticed how the darkness outside had taken over. It was only then that he realized just how much Emma had become a part of his life, how much he needed her, in ways he wasn't ready to admit. "I'm fine, Emma," he said, attempting to sound more reassuring than he felt. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Just caught up in some work. It's nothing." But Emma didn't seem convinced. She stepped further into the room, her gaze soft yet searching. "You don't have to pretend," she said quietly. "I've seen how much you're carrying. It's okay to take a break." Her words, gentle, yet full of understanding, seemed to pierce the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. He had never been one to lean on others, to show weakness. But in that moment, with her standing there, something inside him cracked. Maybe it was the exhaustion, maybe it was the frustration that had built up over the years. But Alexander found himself letting go of the tight grip he had held on his emotions for so long. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed, his voice low, raw. "I don't know how to be both a father and a CEO. I don't know how to fix things. Not for Sophie, not for myself. I'm just tired, Emma." Emma didn't say anything at first. She simply stepped closer to him, her presence a quiet comfort. Then, softly, she reached out and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, a simple gesture of empathy that seemed to undo the knots in his chest. "You don't have to have all the answers, Alexander," she said, her voice steady. "No one does. But you're not alone in this. You have Sophie. You have me. We're in this together." The words hung in the air between them, a promise of solidarity. And as they stood there in the dim light of the study, something shifted. Something fragile and tender passed between them, an understanding, a bond that was unspoken yet undeniable. Emma wasn't just the nanny anymore. She wasn't just the caretaker of his daughter. She was something more, someone who saw him, who understood his pain, his exhaustion, in a way no one else ever had. For a moment, Alexander allowed himself to lean into that feeling. He let go of the tension in his shoulders, the weight of his responsibilities. And as he looked into Emma's eyes, he saw something that took him completely by surprise, a flicker of hope, of something that could be more than just a fleeting moment of comfort. Before he could say anything, before he could acknowledge the new, delicate feeling stirring inside him, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. Sophie had wandered into the room, her small figure barely visible in the dim light. "Daddy." Sophie's voice was soft, almost tentative, and she looked up at Alexander with wide, sleepy eyes. "Is everything okay?" Alexander's heart squeezed in his chest. He quickly stood up, his attention shifting to his daughter. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Go back to bed. I'll be up in a minute." Sophie nodded, though her eyes flickered briefly to Emma before she retreated back down the hallway. Alexander watched her go, feeling a deep ache in his chest for the daughter who had been through so much. And then he turned back to Emma. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice full of meaning, "for being here." Emma smiled, a soft, knowing smile that made his heart beat a little faster. "You don't need to thank me, Alexander. I'm here because I want to be. For both of you." There was a long pause, a silence that stretched between them as the weight of her words settled in. Alexander wasn't sure what the future held. He wasn't sure if he was ready to let someone in again, not after everything he had been through. But there was something undeniable about the pull between them, something he couldn't ignore. "I should go," Emma said softly, breaking the silence. She took a step back, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than necessary. "Good night, Mr. Hart." "Good night, Emma," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As she left the room, Alexander stood there for a long time, the weight of her presence still lingering in the air. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew that something had changed. Something he wasn't sure he was ready for, but something he couldn't deny. Every touch, every smile, every fleeting moment between them only seemed to make things harder. She wasn't supposed to feel this way, and he definitely wasn't supposed to. But somewhere along the way, their hearts had started to speak a language neither of them could ignore. The days that followed were a mix of normalcy and tension. Sophie was beginning to trust Emma more, but the connection between Emma and Alexander was becoming harder to ignore. They continued their routines, Emma caring for Sophie, Alexander handling his high-pressure role as a CEO. But the unspoken bond between them grew more complicated with each passing day. Emma had always been the type to keep her emotions in check, to maintain a certain level of professionalism. But lately, she found herself distracted by Alexander in ways she hadn't expected. There were moments when their eyes would meet across a room, and she could feel something shift in the air, a current of energy that neither of them could deny. But she had never intended to fall for him. She couldn't. He was her boss, and she was just the nanny. It was complicated enough trying to navigate her relationship with Sophie, let alone with the man who had hired her. As for Alexander, he found himself caught between duty and desire. He hadn't let anyone get close to him since Charlotte's death. He'd buried himself in work, keeping people at a distance, afraid of losing anyone else. But Emma, her kindness, her quiet strength, and the way she made Sophie smile in a way no one else could, she was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just that he admired her. He needed her in ways that went beyond the simple need for a nanny. She was someone who saw him, truly saw him, in a way no one had in years. One evening, as Emma prepared dinner, Sophie sat at the table, her little hands playing with her food, absent-mindedly pushing her peas around her plate. Emma noticed her silence, the way Sophie's brow furrowed in thought. It wasn't unusual for Sophie to be pensive, but tonight it seemed different. There was something more there, a quiet sadness in her eyes. Emma sat down beside her. "Sophie, honey, is something bothering you?" Sophie looked up at Emma, her big blue eyes full of confusion. I don't want Daddy to be sad anymore, she said in a small voice, her words heavy with innocence and wisdom far beyond her years. Emma's heart broke at the simplicity of the statement. I know, sweetheart, she said softly, reaching over to gently brush a strand of hair from Sophie's face. I know it's hard to see him like that, but sometimes even grown-ups need time to heal. Just like you, he's been through a lot. But he's not alone. And neither are you. Sophie's lips trembled as she stared down at her plate. Will he be okay? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Emma smiled gently, hoping to reassure her. He will. It just takes time. But you and I, she paused, looking down at the little girl. We're going to help him. We're a team, remember? Sophie nodded slowly, though the doubt still lingered in her eyes. Emma could tell that the little girl was trying to understand, trying to make sense of the complicated emotions swirling around her. Emma wished she could take away that uncertainty, that confusion. She wished she could make things easier for Sophie, for Alexander. But she couldn't fix everything. Not on her own. That night after dinner, as Alexander sat in the study working late, Emma found herself lingering outside the door. She had been keeping her distance lately, unsure of how to navigate the feelings that had been growing between them. But Sophie's words earlier had struck a chord deep within her, and now, standing there, she found herself wanting to reach out to him. She had seen the way he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, the way he tried to hold everything together for his daughter. Without thinking, she knocked gently on the door. A moment later, Alexander's voice called from within. Come in. Emma opened the door slowly, her heart racing as she stepped into the dimly lit study. Alexander was sitting at his desk, papers spread out before him, his face etched with fatigue. When he looked up, his expression softened, though there was still a guardedness in his eyes. Is everything okay? He asked, his voice laced with concern. I just wanted to check in, Emma said, her voice soft but steady. I know it's been a lot lately with Sophie adjusting and everything. And with your work, Alexander sighed, rubbing his temple as if the weight of the world were pressing down on him. I appreciate that, Emma. Really. But I'm fine. I just have a lot on my plate. Emma hesitated, taking a step closer. I know it's hard, but you don't have to do it all alone, you know. Alexander's gaze flickered toward her, and for a moment, their eyes locked. There was something in his gaze, something raw and vulnerable, that made Emma's breath catch in her throat. She didn't know what it was, but it was there in the way he looked at her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. I'm used to doing things on my own, he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. I've always been the one to fix everything. But with Sophie, it's different. I don't know how to fix her. I don't know how to fix any of this. Emma's heart ached at his words. She could see the pain in his eyes, the frustration. It was the same frustration she had seen in her own reflection when things seemed too big to handle, too out of control. But unlike Alexander, Emma wasn't used to keeping everything inside. She wasn't used to pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. You don't have to have all the answers, Alexander, she said softly, her voice gentle but firm. Not for Sophie. Not for me. We're all just trying to figure things out. But we don't have to do it alone. For a moment, the room was silent. And then, before either of them could say another word, Alexander did something Emma hadn't expected. He stood up from his desk, walked over to where she was standing, and without a word, he reached out and gently took her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like everything. In that brief, intimate moment, the distance between them seemed to vanish. The tension that had been building for days, weeks even, dissipated as he held her hand, his thumb brushing against her skin in a way that made her heart skip a beat. Thank you, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know how to do this, but I'm glad you're here. Emma's breath caught in her chest, her pulse quickening as she looked up at him. The moment hung in the air, fragile and unspoken, but filled with everything they both needed to say. And as she stood there hand in hand with Alexander, she realized something. This wasn't just about Sophie anymore. It wasn't just about the past or the weight of their responsibilities. It was about them and the possibility of something new. something real. But the question remained, was she ready to take that step? Was he? She had always been good at keeping her emotions hidden, but now, standing so close to him, everything she kept buried started to feel impossible to ignore. And Alexander, he was beginning to wonder if he could live without her in his life. The days that followed that quiet moment in the study were full of an unspoken tension that neither Emma nor Alexander could shake. Things between them were changing, shifting in ways neither of them had anticipated. What started as a simple act of comfort, a moment of shared vulnerability, had transformed into something much deeper, more complicated. Emma's heart beat faster whenever Alexander was near, and she knew it wasn't just because of the man. He was strong, powerful, and burdened with the weight of his past. It was because there was something in the way he looked at her now, a softness in his eyes that made her feel seen in ways she hadn't expected. His presence had started to feel like more than just a fleeting, temporary part of her life. And Alexander, he was beginning to realize that his life, his world, had become a little quieter without her in it. The house felt emptier when she wasn't around, and he noticed how Sophie had started looking for Emma even when she wasn't required to. The way his daughter's face lit up when Emma entered the room, it was something he hadn't seen in a long time. But with each passing day, the tension between them grew. Neither of them knew what to say, how to move forward, or whether it was even possible to ignore the feelings stirring between them. Emma had always maintained a professional distance, her duty as Sophie's nanny clear in her mind. But somewhere along the way, she had started to care for Alexander in ways she hadn't planned on, and that scared her. She wasn't ready to admit it, to face the possibility of loving someone again. She had seen how Alexander had loved Charlotte, how the pain of her loss had broken him. Emma had no intention of being a rebound, a fleeting comfort in his life. But when he looked at her the way he did, when he held her hand, when he said he was grateful for her presence, her heart couldn't help but feel something. Something she couldn't quite name. One evening, as Sophie played in the garden, Emma found herself standing at the window, staring out at the flowers that bloomed despite the coldness of the surrounding winter. Her thoughts wandered, as they often did now, back to Alexander. She couldn't deny the connection that had formed between them. She couldn't pretend it didn't exist. But she was also terrified. She had never imagined herself falling for her employer. And yet, here she was, caught in the undertow of emotions that made everything feel uncertain. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside. Alexander stepped into the room, his presence commanding, yet somehow comforting. He smiled when he saw her, though there was a hesitation in his eyes, as if he wasn't quite sure what to say. He had always been good at hiding his feelings, at keeping people at a distance. But with Emma, it was different. She made him feel things he couldn't ignore. "I've been meaning to talk to you," Alexander began, his voice quiet. "I know things have been complicated lately." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft, unsure of where this conversation was headed. I don't know what's going on between us," he admitted, his eyes searching hers. "You've been a part of Sophie's life for a while now, and I'm grateful for everything you've done. But I can't shake this feeling that we're crossing boundaries?" Emma interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. She had said the words before she could stop herself, and now they hung in the air between them, charged with the weight of everything they hadn't said. Alexander's face softened. "Something like that," he said, taking a step closer. "I know I shouldn't feel this way. You're my employee, and I'm your employer. This is all so complicated, but I can't help it. I can't ignore how much I've started to rely on you, how much I've come to care for you." Emma's breath caught in her throat. Alexander, she didn't know what to say. Her heart was racing, her mind spinning. She had known this was coming, had known this moment would arrive when the tension between them became too much to ignore. But now that it was here, she didn't know how to respond. "Please don't say anything if you don't feel the same way," Alexander continued quickly, his words rushing out. "I don't want to make things more difficult. I just had to be honest with you. I've never felt this way before. Not with anyone." Emma's eyes softened as she looked at him. She saw the vulnerability in his face, the fear of rejection that he was trying so hard to hide. She wanted to say something to ease the tension between them, but her emotions were tangled up in knots. She had always been afraid of being vulnerable, of opening herself up to someone who could break her heart. But Alexander was different. She could feel it in the way he spoke, in the way he looked at her. I don't know what I feel, Alexander, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I never thought this would happen. But, but, he asked, leaning in slightly, as if hanging on to her every word. But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something when I'm around you, Emma admitted, her words coming out in a rush. I don't know what it means. I don't know if it's the right thing. But I can't ignore it anymore. For a moment, they both stood in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. And then, without thinking, Alexander took another step closer to her. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his touch warm and familiar. I don't know what this means either, he said softly, but I do know that I can't imagine my life without you in it. And I want to figure this out. With you. Emma's heart fluttered in her chest, her breath shallow as she looked up at him. She had always been afraid of falling for someone, afraid of losing herself in someone else's world. But with Alexander, there was something different. She didn't feel lost. She felt like she was finally seeing a future that could be hers, one where she wasn't just a caretaker, but someone who was valued, loved even. She took a deep breath, her hand resting lightly on his, the warmth of his touch grounding her. I want to figure it out too, she said softly. The silence between them was filled with a quiet understanding, a shared promise that this was only the beginning. It wasn't supposed to be this way. They weren't supposed to feel this way. But now, standing in the quiet of the night, with hearts laid bare, everything had changed. And in that change, they were left to wonder, was love enough to overcome the barriers that kept them apart? The days after that moment in the study felt like a blur. Emma couldn't quite put into words the whirlwind of emotion she had been feeling. She had always prided herself on being steady, grounded, and in control. But ever since the conversation with Alexander, everything had shifted. Her heart had become a tangled mess of hope and fear, longing and caution. And Alexander, his presence lingered everywhere, in every room, every corner of the house, every fleeting glance. They hadn't spoken of it again. The words had been said, and that was enough. They both understood what was hanging between them, but neither knew how to move forward. For Alexander, the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart were crumbling, piece by piece, with every passing day. Emma was becoming a constant presence in his life, and it was no longer just about Sophie, though she would always be the center of his world. It was about something more, something deep, something real. But for Emma, the stakes felt higher. She wasn't sure how to navigate this uncharted territory. She had never imagined that she would fall for Alexander, especially not in the midst of all the complexities of their lives. She wasn't sure if she could risk her heart, if she could allow herself to trust him with all the pieces of her that she had kept hidden for so long. But each time he smiled at her, each time their eyes met across the room, she felt the pull, the undeniable connection that made her question everything she thought she knew. One evening, as Sophie was settling into bed after a long day, Emma found herself alone in the kitchen, washing the dishes and lost in her thoughts. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustling of wind outside. It was in these moments, when the world seemed to stand still, that Emma's thoughts would drift back to Alexander. She found herself wondering what it would be like to kiss him, to let the emotion she had been holding back finally break free. Just as she finished putting the last dish away, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to find Alexander standing in the doorway, his face slightly more relaxed than usual, though there was still a hint of the weight he carried with him. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said softly, his voice low and hesitant. I just wanted to check in. How's Sophie doing? Emma smiled as she wiped her hands on a towel, trying to mask the sudden fluttering in her chest. She's doing well. She had a bit of a meltdown earlier, but nothing too serious. It's just part of adjusting. Alexander nodded, but his eyes seemed to linger on her in a way that made Emma's heart skip a beat. There was something in his gaze now, something that spoke volumes without him saying a word. He stepped closer to her, and she could feel the air between them shift, charged with the electricity that had been building for weeks. Emma, he said her name softly, like a prayer. Her name felt different when he said it, more intimate, more personal. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to pull away. There was no hiding, no pretending. She was standing there, vulnerable and open, ready to face whatever was coming next. I've been thinking about us, Alexander continued, his voice steady, but with a hint of uncertainty. About everything we've said, everything we haven't said. I don't want to keep hiding from this. From what's between us. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, unsure if she truly wanted to hear the answer. I mean, Alexander paused, taking a step closer until there was barely any space left between them. I don't want to pretend that I don't feel this pull towards you, that I don't want to be with you. I can't keep pretending that this, what we have, isn't more than just a fleeting moment. It's real, and I want to see where it goes. Emma's heart raced as she absorbed his words. She could feel the intensity in his voice, the sincerity behind every syllable. She knew this wasn't just about the physical attraction they had for each other. It was deeper than that. They had both been through so much, and yet here they were, standing on the edge of something new, something dangerous, something beautiful. I don't know what this means, Alexander, Emma said, her voice trembling as she looked up at him. I don't know if I'm ready to risk my heart again. I've been hurt before, and I'm scared of making the wrong choice. I know, Alexander said, his hand gently reaching out to touch hers. His touch was warm, comforting, and yet it sent a wave of nervous energy through her. I'm scared too, but I think we're both at a place where we can't ignore what's happening between us anymore. We can't keep pretending that it's just about Sophie. It's about us too. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm inside her. She wasn't sure what to do. What if this was just a momentary attraction, something that would fade when the dust settled? But then she remembered Sophie's words earlier, the way the little girl had hoped that her father wouldn't be sad anymore. Sophie had been right. Maybe, just maybe, they could help each other heal. Maybe love was the missing piece they both needed. She opened her eyes and looked up at him, meeting his gaze with a new sense of clarity. I don't know where this will go, but I'm willing to take the chance. I'm willing to see where we can go together. The moment her words left her lips, Alexander stepped forward, his hands reaching for her, and in a movement that felt as natural as breathing, he kissed her. It was gentle at first, a soft brush of lips, a promise. But then, as if the floodgates had opened, the kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate, as if they both knew that this moment was everything. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and shaken, they stood there for a long moment, their foreheads resting against each other, the weight of their decision settling in. I'm not going to make any promises, Alexander whispered, but I'm willing to try. With you. Emma smiled, feeling something inside her break free, something that had been locked away for far too long. So am I. They had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. The future was uncertain, filled with questions and challenges, but for the first time, they were willing to face it together. And in that, they found something neither of them had expected: hope. The days after their kiss were filled with a quiet understanding. Emma and Alexander had taken their time, allowing themselves to explore the new dynamic that had emerged between them. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but one thing had become clear: they were no longer just employer and employee, caretaker and child. They were something more, something neither of them had planned, but something they were both willing to fight for. At first, Emma had been hesitant, uncertain of how to navigate this new relationship. She had always kept a professional distance, a wall between her heart and the lives of the family she worked for. But with Alexander, that wall had slowly crumbled, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but raw, unspoken emotions. For Alexander, the fear of repeating his past mistakes was ever present. He had loved and lost before, and the thought of risking his heart again, especially with someone like Emma, someone who had become so important to him, terrified him. But with every smile, every touch, every moment they shared, he found himself unable to resist. She was the calm in his chaos, the one person who made him believe in something more than just surviving. She made him want to live. It was a Sunday afternoon when everything seemed to come to a head. Sophie had insisted on having a picnic in the garden, and Emma, ever the thoughtful caregiver, had organized everything. The air was warm, the sun shining through the trees, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt like a home. Laughter filled the air as Sophie ran around, her little voice bubbling with joy. Alexander watched them both from the window, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and love. Emma had transformed their house, had made it feel alive again, and he couldn't deny the effect she had on his daughter. Sophie had become attached to her in a way that was almost impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just Sophie. Alexander had become attached too. He stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against his skin as he made his way toward them. Emma looked up as he approached, a soft smile on her face. There was no longer the awkwardness between them, no more hesitations. They had crossed that line, and now they were here, together, moving forward. "Are we ready to eat?" Alexander asked, his voice teasing but full of warmth. Sophie's eyes lit up at the sight of her father, and she rushed over to him, pulling him into a tight hug. "Papa, look, I made a flower crown for Emma. Do you like it?" Alexander chuckled and bent down to kiss his daughter's forehead. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, his eyes shining with pride. Then he turned to Emma, who was standing a few steps behind, watching the scene unfold with a soft smile. "Thank you for everything, Emma, for making this place feel like home again." Emma felt a flutter in her chest at his words, a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something she had been trying to ignore for so long. She wasn't sure how it had happened, how they had gone from strangers to something more, but she couldn't deny it anymore. She was a part of this family now, in every way that mattered. The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter, good food, and the simple joy of being together. There were no more walls between them, no more doubts. They were building something new, something that had the potential to change everything. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Emma found herself sitting on the bench with Alexander, Sophie playing nearby. She had always been good at staying in the background, observing from a distance, but now, for the first time in a long time, she felt like she truly belonged. There was no more fear of being left behind, no more uncertainty about where her place was. She was right here in this moment with the people who mattered most. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as if he was testing the waters. "About what?" Emma asked, her heart skipping a beat as she turned to look at him. "About the future," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "About us. I know it's only been a short time since everything changed, but I can't help but feel like I've found something I didn't know I was looking for. With you." Emma's breath caught in her throat, and she felt her heart race at his words. It wasn't the first time he had expressed his feelings, but something about the way he said it now made everything feel more real, more permanent. She wasn't sure if she was ready for all of it, the messiness, the uncertainty, the risks, but she was willing to try. For him, for them. "I feel the same," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I never thought I would find someone like you. I never thought I would let myself fall in love again." Alexander reached out and took her hand, his fingers gently brushing against hers. "I don't know what the future holds, Emma, but I do know one thing. I want to face it with you, whatever it may be." Emma's heart swelled at his words, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, love was enough. Love was enough to heal the wounds of the past, to overcome the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. As the sky turned dark and the stars began to appear, Emma rested her head on Alexander's shoulder, Sophie curled up beside them. For the first time in a long time, the future felt full of possibilities. Together, they would face whatever came next. And in each other, they had found something worth fighting for. Everything had changed in a moment. A kiss, a shared look, an unspoken understanding. But love, real love, wasn't just about those fleeting moments. It was about facing the hard truths, the everyday challenges, and fighting for what you believed in, even when everything seemed uncertain. Could their love withstand the test life would throw their way? Months had passed since that unforgettable day in the garden, and with every passing moment, their lives had continued to shift. Emma and Alexander had come a long way from the awkwardness that once defined their relationship. They had discovered each other's quirks, fears, and dreams, slowly weaving themselves into the fabric of each other's worlds. There was a comfort now, a familiarity in the way they moved through the days together. But love, Emma realized, wasn't always as simple as it seemed in the beginning. There were moments when the weight of their different worlds, his high profile career, her modest background, his past pain, and her own unhealed wounds, felt too much to bear. Yet, through it all, they clung to each other. They had chosen to face the world together, no matter what. It was one late evening when the tension first reappeared. Alexander had been working late, his office filled with papers, contracts, and the weight of decisions that didn't always have easy answers. Emma had tried to keep her mind off it, focusing on Sophie's school project, but it wasn't easy. The house felt quiet, a reflection of the distance that had slowly crept in between her and Alexander over the past few weeks. She missed him. She missed the man who had held her close during sleepless nights, who had kissed her like the world would end if he didn't. But now he seemed distant, lost in the demands of his work, as if his role as a CEO was consuming him in ways he hadn't anticipated. She knew he loved her. She knew he cared. But something had changed, something she couldn't put into words. That evening, she found herself standing in the doorway of his office, watching him work. The glow of the desk lamp cast shadows over his tired face, and his brow furrowed as he read through yet another email. For a moment, she hesitated, but then the words came, as if they had been building up inside her for weeks. Alexander, she called softly. He looked up, his eyes dark with exhaustion. Hey, he said, his voice rough. Sorry, I didn't hear you come in. Emma took a deep breath. We need to talk. Alexander frowned, setting his papers down. What's going on? I don't know how to say this, but Emma trailed off, searching for the right words. I feel like we're losing each other. I miss the way we used to be, when it was just us, when it felt like we were building something together. But now it feels like you're slipping away from me. There was a long silence, the tension thick in the air. Alexander stood, pushing his chair back and walking toward her. I didn't realize you felt that way, he said softly. I've been so caught up in work and making sure I'm doing right by everyone, by Sophie, by you, but I never meant to make you feel alone. I know you're doing your best, Emma replied, her voice shaking. But sometimes I feel like I'm just a part of your world, not the center of it. And I need you to see me, Alexander. I need you to be here, not just physically, but emotionally. Alexander's heart clenched at the raw vulnerability in her voice. He reached out, cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away the tears she hadn't even realized had fallen. I'm sorry, he whispered. I've been so focused on everything else that I forgot to focus on what truly matters, on us. I can't lose you, Emma. I won't. She closed her eyes, feeling the sincerity in his touch, in his words. It wasn't just about the grand gestures. It was about the quiet moments, the small acts of love and attention that made her feel valued. She needed him to be present, not just for Sophie, not just because of the responsibilities he carried, but for her, for them. I don't want to lose us either, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But we have to fight for this, Alexander. We have to make time for each other, even when everything else feels like it's falling apart. He nodded, his forehead resting against hers. I promise. I'll do better. We'll figure this out together. That night, as they lay in bed, their fingers intertwined, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over her. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, and there would be challenges they couldn't predict. But one thing was certain. They were in this together. And with that, they had something worth fighting for. They had faced the hardest part of their journey. The silence, the distance, the fear of losing each other. But now, standing on the other side, they knew that true love wasn't just about overcoming obstacles. It was about growing together, learning to trust, and finding strength in one another. Was their love enough to endure everything life threw at them? Weeks passed, and though the challenges of life didn't disappear, something within their relationship had shifted. Emma and Alexander had found a new rhythm, one that balanced their individual needs with the love they shared. Their conversations were no longer just about responsibilities or logistics. They were about dreams, fears, and the quiet moments that spoke louder than words. They had found their way back to each other. Sophie had noticed the change. The light in her eyes seemed brighter when she looked at them, as though she understood, in her own innocent way, that her parents were finally on the same page. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They were a family, a unit built not just on love, but on the commitment to weather every storm together. It was a Saturday afternoon when they decided to take a much needed break. Sophie had begged them to go to the lake, a spot they had visited many times over the years. It was one of those places where time seemed to slow down, where the world felt more peaceful. The drive was quiet, but not in an uncomfortable way, more like the silence that comes after healing. They didn't need to fill every moment with words. Their presence alone was enough. The air was crisp as they arrived, and Sophie immediately ran toward the water, her laughter echoing in the distance. Emma and Alexander followed, their hands brushing together as they walked side by side. There was something sacred about this moment, about the simplicity of being together, of feeling the weight of the world lift when they were in each other's company. "Remember the first time we came here?" Alexander asked, his voice low as he turned to Emma. She smiled, her eyes meeting his. "I do. You were so nervous about Sophie getting too close to the water." He laughed softly, a sound that always made Emma's heart skip. "And you were so calm, telling me that kids needed to get dirty and wet." "You were right, though. She's always been fearless." Emma chuckled. "She takes after you in that regard." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "I don't know about that." "Well," Emma said, her smile softening as she looked at their daughter, "maybe not completely. But she's definitely inherited your passion. You both get that from each other. It's something special." They stood there for a moment, watching Sophie run along the shore, her arms spread wide like she was flying. The sight brought a peacefulness Emma hadn't known she needed. It was as if all the stress, all the doubts, had melted away in the warmth of this moment. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Alexander said, his voice serious now, pulling Emma's attention back to him. "About what?" she asked, her heart suddenly racing. "About us. About our future," he continued. "We've come so far in such a short time. And I want to keep going, Emma. I want to build a life with you, not just for Sophie, but for us. For the first time, I feel like I'm not just living in the past anymore. I'm living for today, for tomorrow." Emma's breath caught in her throat as she met his gaze. His words hit her harder than she expected, and she felt the raw emotion in them. There was no more uncertainty, no more fear. It was just the truth laid bare between them. He had finally allowed himself to be vulnerable, to commit fully to the love they had built. "I want that too," she said softly, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions flooding her. "I want to build a life with you, Alexander. A real one. Together." Alexander smiled, his eyes warm and full of promise. "Then let's do it. Let's make it happen. Whatever it takes." In that moment, Emma realized that love wasn't just about the highs, the passion, or the easy moments. It was about the willingness to choose each other, day after day, even when things weren't perfect. It was about facing life's challenges hand in hand, knowing that with each other, they could conquer anything. And most of all, it was about finding joy in the quiet, everyday moments that built the foundation of their relationship. They walked towards Sophie, hand in hand, ready to embrace whatever the future held. As they joined her by the water, laughing and playing as a family, Emma couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. They had come through the storm together, and now they were stronger for it. They had found something real, something lasting, a love that would endure. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, Alexander pulled Emma close, his arm wrapped around her waist. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. Everything felt right. Everything felt complete. "We're going to be okay," Emma whispered, her voice full of hope. "We are," Alexander replied, kissing the top of her head. "We always will be." And in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the lake, the laughter of their daughter, and the love they had built, Emma knew that this was just the beginning of their story, a story of love, commitment, and the promise of a future they would create together.